One characteristic that appears to be uniquely true of human beings is that we are meaning-seeking creatures. Our difficulty, however, lies in knowing where to find it. In belonging, purpose, transcendence, storytelling, each is a good desire, but relying on ourselves to find meaning in them leaves us with only those fractured remnants of a far deeper reality. What if it was never about the meaning we make, but the meaning who made us? Well, in 1946, Viktor Frankl, otherwise known as prisoner number 119,104 in his Nazi concentration camp, penned his best-selling memoir, Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, Frankl reflects the difference between those who survived in the camps and those who died primarily came down to one thing and one thing alone: meaning. Those who had it and those who did not. Observing society at large, Frankl diagnosed the problem this way: people have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. One characteristic that appears to be uniquely true of human beings is that we are meaning-seeking creatures. Our difficulty, however, lies in knowing where to find it. If you need heat, you light a fire. If you're thirsty, drink water. If you need directions, then as my father-in-law would say, you get on the Google. After all, if it's not on Google Maps, it's not on planet Earth. But how do you find meaning? And it doesn't seem to help that everybody who you ask for directions points you a different way. Some say it's in what you do. Others say it's in who you are. Some say it's about helping others. Others say it's about self-help. Some say it's a destination. Others say it's all about the journey. Of course, one place where you will find a greater consensus today is among millennials and Generation Z, most of whom will agree that actually, rather than searching for meaning outside of oneself, you need to look within. In the words of Callum, a college freshman who stood up and asked Os Guinness this question during a Veritas forum 2 years ago: I've always been more attracted to the idea that we make our own meaning. What do you think about that? Now, what Callum vocalized that night lies at the very heart of this question: is meaning something that we make, or is it something we were made for? If Callum had asked that question of Jesus Christ, perhaps Jesus might have responded with a story that he liked to tell. It's a story about two men who built their homes on two very different foundations. One built his house on the sand, and the other built his house on a rock. And the thing about the rock is, it's solid, it's unmoving. The design of the house is configured to the structure of the rock. The rock shapes you, you don't shape the rock. But sand, well, sand is malleable. Sand can be moved and molded and shaped and prodded. Sand can be one thing one day and something else entirely the next. Who wouldn't want to work with sand? And today we live in a world of sand artists. Identity, sexual orientation, gender, feelings, truth, beliefs, everything is fluid. Today it might look one way, but who's to say that tomorrow it won't take a completely different shape? The only contours defining your life are the ones that you set for yourself. The words of William Shakespeare, definitely a man ahead of his time, perfectly encapsulates the spirit of our age. And this, above all else, to thine own self be true. In other words, meaning is a DIY project. Do it yourself. After all, what alternative is there? If naturalism is correct, then there is no meaning out there to find anyway. Science has already explained it all away, with the universe amounting to nothing more than time plus matter plus chance. But the problem with this thesis, however, is that if this is true for the universe, then doesn't the same hold true for human beings as well? How is it possible to talk about meaning if we are nothing more than cosmic evolutionary accidents? In his best-selling work, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Yuval Harari puts it this way: As far as we can tell from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. Hence, any meaning that people ascribe to their lives is just a delusion. Just a delusion. And yet, ironically, one that we actually rely on for our survival. From a naturalistic perspective, we have evolved to be meaning-seeking creatures because our quest to find meaning, we are told, aids our survival. And therefore, we have to delude ourselves into thinking that we can make something meaningful from our lives, even though by our own admission, as creatures who are just dancing to our DNA, we don't actually have the free will to make meaningful choices. It's quite the conundrum. In the words of renowned atheist, the late Christopher Hitchens, it could be that all existence is a pointless joke, but it's not, in fact, possible to live one's everyday life as if this was so. But without any metaphysical rock to found our lives on, what do? Well, we start scrambling for sand, scraping it together to assemble some kind of foundation on which to build our lives. In her recent bestseller, The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters, Emily Estefani-Smith argues that in an age where depression is skyrocketing, people have become consumed with the pursuit of happiness, but they fail to recognize that actually the antidote to depression is not happiness, it's meaning. And Smith then identifies 4 pillars of meaning which people turn to in order to prop up their lives: belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling. It's an incredible thing to belong to a family, especially an Italian-American family. I can still remember the first week that I met my mother-in-law, and by day 3, she'd already cornered me in the kitchen and given me this massive bear hug as she loudly exclaimed, "Jo, you're like Miss America." And I never called any of Vince's other girlfriends that. High praise indeed. But even within the best of families, even those gracious enough to put up with our flaws and our foibles, is it fair to ask those relationships to carry the burden of anchoring our sense of meaning? The movie Jerry Maguire is famous for its last scene when Jerry declares to his wife, Dorothy, "You complete me." But actually, on reflection, what kind of sentiment is that? What pressure do we put on a spouse when we try to make them the ground of our being? Somewhere along the way, we stop seeing them as a person to be loved, and we begin to treat them as a means to an end, as someone just to prop up our own identities. And then even in the healthiest of relationships, we're still left with that deep down, sickening fear that one day you will open your eyes and they won't be there anymore. Because even love can't conquer death, right? Drawing our attention to the obvious, psychologist Jonathan Haidt notes that if true love is defined as eternal passion, it is biologically impossible. One way or another, every relationship is headed for heartbreak. Our belonging comes with an expiration date. Perhaps then we'd be better off putting ourselves into that pillar of purpose. And for millennials and Gen Z, today's search for purpose, it often takes the form of social activism. Everyone has a cause. But the trouble with putting your purpose in a cause is that even the most just of causes rely on unjust causes. They rely upon the character and the conviction of fallible human beings, and that is some very shifting sand indeed. This is a problem that the atheist political philosopher John Gray recognizes in his essay Humanism and Flying Saucers, in which he argues with brutal honesty that to put your ultimate hope in humanism, in the progress of humanity, is as irrational as founding a religion upon a belief in flying saucers. And Gray writes, civilization is natural for humans, but so is barbarism. For modern humanists, the solution is simple. Human beings must in future be more reasonable. These enthusiasts for reason have not noticed that the idea that humans may one day be more rational requires a greater leap of faith than anything in religion, since it requires a miraculous breach in the order of things. The idea that Jesus returned from the dead is not as contrary to reason as the notion that human beings will in future be different from how they have always been. So according to Gray, it is a greater leap of faith to ground your hope in humanity than it is to put it in God. Why? Because how are we supposed to fix the world when we can't even fix ourselves? And fix it for what? If there's no ultimate meaning, if we're just dying mammals in a dying universe that's only growing colder and darker, then why bother? If meaning is a DIY job, if we're each responsible for our own meaning and no one else's, it's not much of an incentive to sacrifice your comfort for the good of another. No wonder then that many, disillusioned with causes, are fixing their gaze on the transcendent instead. And just this week, The New Yorker published an article titled Astrology in the Age of Uncertainty, highlighting the resurgence of New Age spirituality among millennials. According to a 2017 Pew Research poll, 30% of Americans believe in astrology, while a report from IBIS World found that Americans spend $2.2 billion annually on mystical services like tarot reading and palmistry. What does that tell us? That in a generation that is constantly being told to take charge and make their own meaning, only to find themselves in a world spiraling out of control, people are desperately searching for a secure place in a grander story. Now, the stars may be called comfort, but to many it's better than nothing. Transcendence leads quickly to the fourth pillar of storytelling. The award-winning American poet Muriel Rukeyser once noted that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. We are storied creatures. There's nothing we desire more than to be part of something bigger than ourselves. It's what motivates so much of our activism, that if we play our part, then one day we too might have stories to tell, stories that testify to the fact that we lived, that we achieved, that our lives meant something once. And yet for all the heroic stories, for all of the stories of triumph and overcoming, how many more end in defeat and tragedy? Last year I was speaking at a formal event, but it was the kind of event where every single woman looked so immaculately put together that it was easy to assume that their lives were perfect. And so it was something of a shock when at the end of my talk, a woman stood up in the Q&A and she asked this question. She said, "Joe, you speak about human trafficking like it's an international problem, but I was trafficked here in my hometown, the city of Dallas, for 20 years by my own parents." And then she rolled up her sleeves to show me the burns on her arms where she'd been tied down with ropes, and the marks where people had stubbed out cigarettes on her, and then the scars where she tried to kill herself. And into the stunned silence, she asked this question: what does the church have to say to somebody like me? You know, if meaning in life requires you to be the lead character in a heroic story, then meaning is an incredibly exclusive plot of land reserved only for the most fortunate. If there's nothing to us apart from the stories we have to tell, then ultimately all we can ever amount to are the things that others have done to us and the things that we have done to ourselves. And that's a story that rarely ends in happily ever after. In the words of Henry David Thoreau, most men lead lives of quiet desperation, and they die with their song still inside them. Belonging, purpose, transcendence, storytelling, each of these are necessary components of meaning, but by themselves, are they really enough to prop up a life? Over 100 years ago, Bertrand Russell, who was a proponent of making your own meaning, he called living this way a free man's worship. But according to Russell, to experience this freedom, you first have to accept that man is the product of causes which have no prevision of the end that they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of our solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All of these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only in the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Now, my question for Russell is this: what firm foundation? Belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling. He's just smashed every single one of those pillars. There are no safe spaces left. There is no home for the soul to inhabit. We tell people to go out and make their own meaning, but with what scaffolding we have left them nothing to build with and nothing to build on. And Russell calls this freedom. But at what cost? The 20th century philosopher Albert Camus commented that the literal meaning of life is whatever you're doing that prevents you from killing yourself. But what are you supposed to do when the literal meaning of life just isn't enough? We're told to go and make our meaning, but it's not working. If it were, we wouldn't be facing a suicide epidemic across this nation. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that in the US, suicide rates between the ages of 10 to 24 have increased by 56% in the last decade. 56%. On average, someone in this country tries to commit suicide every 30 seconds. We're raising a generation all too familiar with unyielding despair. And that is no firm foundation at all. It is crumbling sand. I stand amidst the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand the grains of golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep while I weep, while I weep. Oh God, can I not grasp one within my clasp? Oh God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? That's Edgar Allan Poe expressing some of the despair that so many people feel, the many people who spend their lives building castles out of sand, only for the storms of life to come rolling in and just wash them all away. Of course, the thing about sand is, it didn't start out that way. If you go back to its origins, sand is actually eroded rock. Rock that has been worn away over millennia until we're left with nothing but fragments of a once solid foundation, belonging, purpose, transcendence, storytelling. Each is a good desire, but relying on ourselves to find meaning in them leaves us with only those fractured remnants of a far deeper reality. Perhaps we've had it backwards. Perhaps we've been doing everything the wrong way round. What if it was never about the meaning we make, but the meaning who made us? In 1978, during the summer break between his second and final year, studying at Oxford University, a 21-year-old student set off on a Greyhound tour bus across the United States. Now, he tried to make himself belong. He tried to find purpose. He had tried for transcendence, but nothing was working. And so he set off on an adventure, hoping that maybe through storytelling and making memories, he would find a sense of meaning. And after a few weeks, he got to the Grand Canyon, and as they pulled up, and he stood looking out on perhaps the greatest rock formation on planet Earth. And he was standing there looking at it with no one in eyesight and no one within hearing distance. Suddenly, he heard a voice saying 3 words that changed everything in his life. I made it. I made it. That was my dad. And he then spent the next 3 days going back on that bus to the East Coast, all the while trying to process the fact that if God made the Grand Canyon, then that means he made him too. All of that trying to make meaning totally eclipsed by just one encounter, one word spoken by his maker. And last December, dear friends threw us a baby shower for our son Raphael, which included a wish list where all the guests were invited to write out their wishes and hopes and dreams for the baby. And most of the wishes were encouragements for things that Raphael might do himself in the future. Wishes like, I hope he has his mum's British accent, or I hope he becomes a Red Sox fan. Vince didn't love that one. But my favorite wish list was actually the one filled in by Michael Ramsden, who scrawled across the entire card where all of the wishes were supposed to be listed out. He just wrote these 3 bold words, only Jesus matters. And that's the card that we actually have hanging up in our nursery, because Michael is absolutely right, although don't tell him I said that. But the only way to have a life full of meaning is to have a life full of Jesus. My father tried to create meaning out of romantic relationships, but only Jesus offers a belonging that will never spoil or fade. My father sought meaning in academic success, but only Jesus gives us a purpose that doesn't depend upon our success. My father searched for transcendence in recreational drugs, but only Jesus can fill us with a spirit that brings true joy and lasting peace. And my father sought out adventure on the road, but only Jesus can take those fractured, painful pieces of our lives and weld them into a story of hope and redemption. My father thought he was searching for meaning, but meaning was searching for him. And meaning found him. Just as meaning will find anyone here with us this weekend, anyone at all, with a heart that is ready to say, only Jesus matters. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock, I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Amen.